I must confess that I am a theme park enthusiast. I rode the big one at Pleasure Beach, despite my mother insisting that I would die going up its 200-foot climb. The less said about its unfortunate choice of name, the better. I have been on those janky thrill rides at pop-up carnivals that jitter against the ground as I whiz about, hoping the ride doesn't spontaneously come apart in a flurry of metal and lawsuits. I've also been on Nemesis at Alton Towers, one of the most consistently popular roller coasters in the UK since it opened in 1994. Which makes sense, it's a really good ride and it has a sort of excitable reputation among roller coaster fans who visit Alton Towers. But did you know that this ride had a sister? In March 2012, Alton Towers opened the ride Nemesis Sub Terra, which was a hybrid of a drop tower with this immersive walkthrough experience themed around an alien infestation. I recall the hype for this ride prior to opening, and it would be around this time 10 years ago that the ride was getting ready to scare its first guests. It was described as your worst nightmare underground.
Your worst nightmare underground.
Hence, Sub Terra. It's a pun. It even managed to receive a 12A rating for riders, which I have not really seen many attractions hold before.
It's this immersive experience, very similar to you get when you're watching a film. So they came and they visited and they gave it a 12A classification.
For reference, 12A is like the UK equivalent of a PG-13 rating. Attendees would queue, probably for an hour or so, to be shepherded into a small military-themed facility, wherein you would be yelled at to not do anything stupid by these masked-up soldiers named phalanx officers. There was a pre-show to give the audience a better understanding of the story behind the ride, deeming the eggs safe for public viewing.
All hazardous material has been made safe for civilian viewing.
Before they would escort you down the main chamber where these mysterious alien eggs are, you would be sat down and strapped in to watch the egg. Of course, that doesn't last long. After telling the guests the egg showed signs of life, the power fails and sirens start blaring. When they come back on, the egg has hatched. The guests are then dropped down into a chamber where more eggs are, before slowly being raised back up, being sprayed with liquids, being poked in the back and brushed against your legs by something unknown. There were spurts of air against your neck as if whatever hatched was breathing down your neck, as if the monster was creeping around the walls behind you. The guests are then evacuated back into the lifts, which are intercepted by the monster, which shakes and vibrates the lift as well as plunging it into darkness. The lift doors manage to open back to high ground, where a phalanx officer covered in blood jump scares the guests, and are then led out through this strobing metal maze of air cannons and loud sounds, before you are chased out of the maze by a rabid phalanx officer to the exit of the ride. I imagine this ride sounds quite intense and atmospheric, and all around an interesting experience for the guests involved. Well, in actuality, this ride is perhaps one of the worst received rides in Alton Towers' recent history, and I'm here to look into why that is. When we go to a theme park of whatever kind, it isn't a huge stretch to say that there is some otherworldly ambience to these locations. Everything is usually in pristine condition. There's an attention to, at least in my experience, the physical geography of the park and how the paths are laid out and where the main attractions are situated. There is also a notion of performativity within the park as well. What do I mean by performativity though? I'm definitely glad you asked that question. Magic and theatre are actually very common motifs within a lot of theme parks. Alton Towers has In the Hall of the Mountain King, a fantastical song if I ever heard one, as its unofficial theme song, which is now playing in the background. Disney naturally uses magic and fantasy, given most of its stories are fairy tales, and while other parks are perhaps a tad less explicit, such as Universal Studios or Blackpool Pleasure Beach, they still use certain vernacular choices to conform to the idea that the park returns you to a state of childlike wonder. Fantastic, spectacular, phenomenal. They're all in this air of something beyond expectation. Yes, it is a little bit obvious in a marketing sense. Underselling your theme park isn't exactly, peak business strategies, but it is still important to notice the flavouring of the words that they're using, especially in tandem with words like fun, memory, and even more juvenile words, such as speedy, found in Pleasure Beach's fast passes. You get a feel for the idea of the theme park, which creates the image of revisiting the feelings of a child filled with excitement at visiting somewhere that's like another world. We know it's not providing a literal reality of magic nor fantasy, but rather serving fairy tale realness, a facade in which the audience can escape from their everyday lives, which is where the theatrical elements kick in. Even Disneyland's castle was built primarily for the immersion of the guests within the park. It has no independent history based on the events of the past, rather it exists because Disneyland exists. To hone in on something more specific, many rides also have their own internal world that the attendee takes part in as they traverse the ride. These are not merely spinning metal cylinders, they are in fact gunpowder barrels belonging to pirates, complete with a whimsical pirate-esque voiceover sounding off some unimaginative little piratisms in the background. So it invites the audience to lightly suspend their disbelief and encourage them to live beyond the everyday. They become actors in a sense, encouraged to take part in "you are a pirate" and so on. The theming also gives it an actual target audience. People who like pirate-themed things, I guess, and since it's a gentler ride, it's not entirely infeasible to say that this attraction is aimed at a younger audience. This is all quite basic stuff, but once you strip away the whole to reveal its components, you begin to see the magic of a theme park and how each individual element merges together to form a whole world that the audience immerses themselves within. The guests who attend the park are more than just a name, however. They all have different needs and group dynamics that the park has to accommodate for. One demographic, for example, is families. Theme parks are commonly thought of as places for families to go for a planned day out, so capitalizing on creating special moments on the main floors and paths of the park is something to consider, for the interest of the park as a business, as well as for the guests in their own escapism. When you see a mother taking a picture of her child hugging the Sonic the Hedgehog mascot, that's a moment for bonding and a memory that brings the family closer together. Theme parks are not exactly exclusive venues touted only for the rich. Usually, I'm looking at you, Disneyland, $128 a day? What the There's something working class families and people use to give themselves an experience they deserve after so many weeks working 9 to 5. God, it does sound really slimy to profit off of that need for bonding and escapism when you put it that way though. In any case, the theme parks are there to satisfy that need. Another need that many of the guests have is the need for excitement and adrenaline to take away from the general inertia of everyday life. That's where the actual ride attributes come into play. It is not enough for certain people, like myself, to merely be spun around in a gunpowder barrel. I am instead a tryhard, an aesthete of adrenaline and disquieted stomachs. Guests like myself need a thrill factor. There's 1,000,001 reasons why someone would want a thrill in the same way that a roller coaster provides, but I want to focus more on a thrill ride's relationship between the rider and the attraction. Roller coasters in the present day are, within theme park fandom spaces, a kind of way to gatekeep real fans of this kind of experience. I can guarantee those who have gone out to a theme park have had debates with their friends about how much someone is missing out because they don't want to ride the roller coasters, that they're wasting their time by just wanting to experience the more gentle side of the park. It's this kind of cultural competitiveness between friends that gives the thrill rides of the park this kind of mythos that surrounds those attractions. Riding a scary ride gives you bragging rights, which you definitely didn't use to make fun of the people scowling at you from the bottom of the ride, who are begrudgingly holding your bags while you have the time of your life. Theme parks know this too. They sell you the pictures of you on the ride. They sell merchandise of the ride, almost as if you have proof of your cultural conquest. So it can be agreed that there is some sort of value in riding these rides for some sort of arbitrary cultural capital. Speaking of merchandise, another type of value a ride has is how exclusive it is. Some people will go to the park just to visit a specific promotion that is happening at the park. For example, Alton Towers had a contract with Sega for a Sonic the Hedgehog themed ride for around 5 years, which totally redressed the previously titled Spinball Whizzer into Sonic Spinball, complete with the then new voice actor for Sonic, Roger Craig Smith, providing some okayly delivered lines that would play during the queue.
That was awesome! You sure did spin!
There was even a hotel room themed after Sonic, and the carts had different characters on them. It could also refer to rides that are due to close down for good too. Rides don't last forever and are taken down from the park after it's had its time. The time limit gives people more urgency to visit than normal if it happens to appeal to them. Queue length plays a role in this too. If it's a really long queue, your brain tells you it's probably a popular ride to get on. The design of the queues are also well thought out so as to not disrupt the aesthetics of the park by not leaking into the main walking areas of the park. They're usually out of the way and are also themed to provide some hype factor to the ride while you wait, alongside a queue estimate on the outside. Queue times can shape the way people navigate the park, and I'm sure if you're watching this you've seen the Defunctland video on the Fast Pass, so I'm not going to go into the specifics of how important queuing is to the overall enjoyment of the park. So to summarise, we have a few different reasons for a ride to have value to a guest, which are appeal to escapist fantasy, cultural value, exclusivity value, queue length, and ultimately the ride's thrill factor. Let's look at the ride Nemesis, the roller coaster, to see how this works out with these metrics in mind. Back when the ride was first opened, the advert for the ride had the usual In the Hall of the Mountain King playing while having this undeniably 90s level CGI monster strap the guests in, so it gives this impression that the ride is inhabited by some sort of monster. This premise might sound stupid, but Alton Towers usually does have some sort of dark fantasy element to many of its thrill rides. 13 has this haunted house in the middle of a forest vibe with a child cursing the ride or something, I don't know. And Oblivion's advert had this strange possessed "don't look down" guy as if the park performs experimental tests on its attendees, so this is not something they just decided out of the blue. Alton Towers has a set focus on dark fantasy, and it's been that way for decades. I do really quickly want to mention that Alton Towers does have a really solid reason for its theming, in that the towers themselves are based on actual Gothic revival architecture, owned by the Earls of Shrewsbury before it was converted into a funfair turned theme park in the 80s. The darker aesthetic lends itself quite well to the theming of the park around its own past, as well as having the aforementioned dark fantasy tone that, for the time, was a standout against the usual way theme parks position themselves as a light-hearted adventure for the young of spirit. Having rides themed around hauntings and sketchy goings-on just fits the lengthy history that is behind the grounds of the park. So if we are to look at Nemesis through its theming and theatrical framing, we can see a fairly simple story surrounding the ride's lore, I guess. There are these fleshy parts that form part of the wall while in the queue that are clearly some sort of growth related to or are a part of the monster. And the music that plays while you wait sounds fairly cinematic. The orchestral ambience definitely gives this grandness of facing something large and imposing. The way the monster is built additionally gives the feeling that the cart station itself takes place from inside the monster. There are also bits of debris around the area of Nemesis, and the rusted look of the tracks complements the idea that the monster is taking over the roller coaster. Also, I don't think it runs like this now, but there was a small stream of water that ran red as if it were the blood of the monster or the people who were, I guess, eaten by the monster as well, but for some reason they stopped doing that. The stream is still there though, it just runs clear now, which is a bit disappointing. Naturally, roller coasters are a bit harder to consistently frame as there's a lot of track and airspace to cover if you want to aggressively decorate the whole ride. There's not much point doing this though, as most of that effort will be wasted because guests will only see a blur of those moments as they go speeding past your elegantly crafted scary monster eye or whatever it is that you've made. Not to mention that, as stated earlier, the kind of mythos surrounding a thrill ride comes from the thrill factor of the ride rather than its atmosphere and fantasy. It's in the name, after all. So the theming and theatrics for Nemesis are good, but fairly inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but needed enough to differentiate this hunk of metal tracks compared to the other hunk of metal tracks scattered throughout the park. The escapism comes from the adrenaline the ride gives to its guests. It therefore makes the thrill factor of the ride one of its main selling points. It's often touted as one of the best roller coasters in the UK, and has appeared consistently in every iteration of the Golden Ticket Awards, which started in 1998, only really slipping below the top 25 steel rides in 2021. For context, the Golden Ticket Awards factor in theme parks worldwide, so a ride keeping in those rankings for that long is probably a good indicator of its thrill factor. Because of Nemesis's fame with theme park enthusiasts, it can also hold a lot of those bragging rights I mentioned earlier, that you managed to go on Nemesis. I'd say that the ride's fame consequently has thrill riders go on it out of obligation. It's a must-see because of the cultural value it has amongst this group of people. You get to be one of the girl bosses gaslighting and gatekeeping. I would say, however, that Nemesis's reputation has diminished a little bit as the years have gone by, especially when other rides were being built in the following years. I do think, however, it has, in its place, earned a kind of trustworthiness of experience in any case. It's still reliably good, but the hype has calmed down. If Nemesis does get taken down one day, however, I can guarantee you that the ride's popularity will soar before its closure, as if Buckingham Palace itself is about to collapse and a flurry of tourists frenzy towards its debris. The queue is also a really fun experience in tandem with the theming I talked about earlier. The layout of the queue intersects with various points of the track, so you really are put face to face with the riders ahead of you as they swerve around that curve or as they climb up the initial first hill of the track. It's almost taunting the people waiting to see if they can handle being so close to these fences and obstacles without feeling like you're about to lose a few limbs. I'm quite tall, so I was undoubtedly thinking this while waiting in the queue. The point being here is that you are consistently placed within close proximity of the ride and are teased of its experience by the guests riding it ahead of you. So now we have a solid basis to know what makes Nemesis so successful in the context of a theme park to its guests. Before we finally dissect Nemesis Sub Terra, it's also important to understand why a guest wants these specific experiences, and why a bad experience on a ride is seemingly so damning for the attendees, as well as the reputation of the theme park. The tourism industry thrives off of romanticizing the images of the world. The Eiffel Tower becomes a beacon for romance, Big Ben becomes a cultural signifier of the sophisticated Brit, and the Taj Mahal becomes a grand structure for the glorious mysteries of the past. We looked at this with evidence earlier on when I honed in on the specific language used to describe the experience of the theme park, as well as briefly looking at some specific needs for certain demographics. A huge part of why we visit places is sightseeing and entering this liminal space. Oh god, here I go again with those. A liminal space that lies beyond the need to work and sustain our own internal world at home. The book The Tourist Gaze 3.0 by John Urey and Jonas Larson has been pretty helpful in understanding the why of tourism for me. And while I'm not treating its words as gospel by any means, it has definitely made the subconscious appeal of theme parks more apparent to me. I will be using their framework here and the term the tourist gaze throughout this segment. So what is the tourist gaze? If we recall that mum taking a photo of her child next to the Sonic the Hedgehog mascot, she didn't automatically have her child miraculously in the perfect pose with an adorable smile. She had to direct her kid to look at the camera and ask her child to say cheese, or perform the happiness a kid feels being in a theme park next to their favorite character. She probably also took a photo of the Sonic mascot because she knows her tasteless child likes Sonic the Hedgehog. That might be the reasoning in her head, but subconsciously, I also think that she is in fact building an aesthetic or portfolio of images documenting her desire to be seen as a happy family. It might seem like conjecture, but if I bring to light the aesthetic of Facebook mums, in the nicest way possible, they without a doubt transform their love of family into a type of aestheticism of baby photos and videos of their kids running around the house. So that photo of her child with Sonic is using her tourist gaze to fuel her own personal desires. The tourist gaze, therefore, is the view of the world people see through when we assume the role of a tourist. We as people start to have preformed understandings of how to enjoy certain areas of the world when we're on vacation. We suddenly see the world around us very differently, and intentionally take our gaze to see, in the majority of cases, a world that is purposefully in stark contrast to our own. There is, however, not one fixed way a tourist gazes. That does depend on class, home location, and other socioeconomic factors. We found that with our Facebook mum, for example. I personally hold the opinion that working class people feel this pressure to be having the most luxurious holiday at all times, else they have, to them, failed at having a holiday. That all-inclusive holiday is a small bite of what perhaps their ideal world could be. A world of free time and minimal labour. When they spend any time on holiday stressing, they bring back their undesirable home life right to the forefront of their getaway. The more wealthy families, however, appear to have a more stripped back holiday style, perhaps picking berries in Italy or escaping to the suburbs. This is perhaps to emulate the feeling of returning to simplicity and harkening back to one's roots, a life without the turmoil of tedious middle-class social struggles, a wholesome community whose social efforts see tangible, sincere results. In any case, there is an ambition to travel in order to lay claim to some ephemeral enlightenment, or a want to satisfy some internal desire lacking in your day-to-day life. Photography is incidentally one of the central pillars that prop up what it means to see through the eyes of the tourist. When a tourist makes a decision to photograph an event or something of interest, they have made the decision that their photograph means something to them. Yuri and Larson note something interesting about the modern era of photography and how we mean to create the perfect image of our tourist fantasy. Photographs that do not instantly charm are erased and retaken, which affords experimentation and control over how people and places are represented. Strikingly, few tourists express any emotional difficulties about deleting photographs even of loved ones. I mean, when have you ever just taken one photo of a landmark and thought, yep, I'll call it a day there? You don't, because you want the perfect picture to capture what you see in that roller coaster or that mascot, and you want other people to see you in that idealized view of the world which you saw. It's really interesting when we take this to something such as the roller coaster photos you can buy of yourself at the ride stalls. I myself have a photo of me riding the Smiler ride at Alton Towers. I'll be talking about the Smiler a little bit later, by the way. But why did I buy that photo? My own justification is because I looked like I was having fun on something exciting. It is proof of my desire to be seen as an exciting person in my otherwise fairly dull little world. You also usually just get one shot. You can't retake the photo you get on the roller coaster, so if it's a good one, then I would feel compelled to buy it. A theme park has an aptitude for serving their guests with personalized experiences, which are tailored to their different preferences and methods of escapism to ultimately make different photographic aesthetics within the same park. The mum gets her family moment, while I get my moment of adrenaline, all in the same location. It all adds up to how the theme park becomes a place of fantasy. If you are as desperate as I am to make my claim seem mildly plausible, then some of this theatricality to perform happiness and act like you're on holiday within tourism also takes root from Irving Goffman's The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life. In fact, John Urey and Jonas Larson even use him for the basis of some of their arguments. Here's a very handy quote to sum up my understanding without making this video obscenely long. The legitimate performances of everyday life are not acted or put on in the sense that the performer knows in advance just what he's going to do, and does this solely because of the effect it is likely to have. The expressions it is felt he is giving off will be especially inaccessible to him. The incapacity of the ordinary individual to formulate in advance the movements of his eyes and body does not mean that he will not express himself through these devices in a way that is dramatized and preformed in his repertoire of actions. In short, we all act better than we know. So what Goffman is implying by we act better than we know is that people subconsciously know how to perform having a holiday. And I believe that is achieved through having been taught by their culture and elders how to behave in that context. So this mother taking a picture of her child is not only teaching their child how to pose for the camera, but also how to have a holiday, and her understanding of holiday making comes from where the mother grew up, as well as the culture she was surrounded by. The child, however, until this point, has not been yet told what to do, so they stand there like an actor who's forgotten their lines until their director frees them from paralysis. Tourism is completely devoured by an interconnected web of desires and the want to act out said desires, and theme parks are just a small corner of the tourist world that encourages this type of pseudo-immersive theatricality. Okay, with all that said, I think we're finally ready to comprehensively tear apart Nemesis Sub Terra. Nemesis Sub Terra as an experience is somewhat like a reboot of a series people had mostly forgotten about, but instead they focus on some inane part like 10% of the audience are familiar with. Sub Terra is kind of like the Fantastic Beasts of Alton Towers. In this case, Sub Terra cashes in way too late on Nemesis. The trouble with Sub Terra is that a lot of the people had forgotten the original ride's lore at this point. The main bulk of the ride's lore was its thrill factor rather than its thematic premise, fun as it may be. People, especially casual visitors of the park, remember Nemesis firstly as being a roller coaster, not the monster that inhabits the roller coaster. Now, Nemesis Sub Terra puts a huge amount of attention into the marketing for the opening of the ride, to the point that it was getting the same amount of publicity that a new roller coaster would be getting in its place. I distinctly remember TV adverts around the park of its impending arrival, and teasers online. The 12A rating for the ride seemed to really grab people's attention too, giving this idea that the ride was simply too scary for younger audiences. I've already described a walkthrough of the ride, but from my own experience riding Sub Terra, I remember only really being interested in the drop tower element of the ride because As I said earlier, I am a tryhard for thrills. The story felt fairly filler as well. That alliteration was unintended, I swear, but it had some quite clear comparisons to Alien as well. I won't go out of my way to say that the actors in the ride were bad. I think it was moreover that the director of the troupe was probably just hammering in the idea that angry shouting equals scary because it was all they were doing at the time, which doesn't really make sense because we as the public were invited to come and see the egg in the first place according to the story. I'm not sure why they were being so egregiously hostile to us being there when it was open to public viewing. I do know from personal experience that being in character for prolonged periods of time can be pretty exhausting, especially while shepherding guests around all day. So I can respect that these people are trained in a certain acting style, and I hope they drank a lot of water to make up for them screaming themselves hoarse every day. In terms of the thrill factor though, you walk through a themed entrance with a fake elevator. Yeah, the elevator doesn't actually go down, it just shakes in a way that could suggest it does. You sit in a drop tower, go down, get poked, hear loud sounds and flashing lights, and then leave. The drop tower, the sole physical thrill you get, definitely felt less than 20 feet though, and once you're told to evacuate, the idea that you would come face to face with the monster is a logical one. But you would be wrong, as it never actually appears in any sort of animatronic or costume or even a shadow. The main complaint about the ride was its length. The initial version of the ride saw guests run straight out into the exit of the ride after leaving the lift, so they attempted to fix this in the second version where they added in a small metal maze to help pad out the ride time. If a ride is immersive, it needs time to submerge the audience within its world, which is why gentler, longer rides focus more on their theming in order to easily allow the riders to escape into the fantasy of the ride. Sub Terra is a hybrid of half walkthrough, half drop tower, so it becomes difficult to understand the main focus of the ride. Is it the drop we're supposed to be excited for? The immersive walkthrough's task seems to be to build up to the drop tower, yet the drop tower is so abruptly finished that, "Oh, was that it?" was a really common response for the attendees once they had left the ride. Although the metal maze did soften the blow of this somewhat upon hearing the initially large negative feedback from the audience. This in particular would be upsetting for guests who would wait up to 2 hours for the ride, as it therefore appears like a waste of time where you could be going on, I don't know, Nemesis? A lengthy time taken in queues is the enemy when the guest finds that the ride has not been worthwhile, on top of the fact that this new thrill ride ruins the attendee's personal fantasy of an adrenaline-filled day. The queue is also not very interesting to be a part of either. There's not much lead up until you're close to the facility where some phalanx soldiers just stare at you as you approach the entrance. When guests find out that there is merely a small drop tower hidden inside a nicely painted sculpture, despite what was advertised, it can linger in their mind throughout the rest of the day. Do remember that when guests attend a theme park, their emotional state tends to be a slightly heightened one in preparation for the big day, like any other holiday, so this disappointment can be more intrusive and severe. I also found that the ride did not succeed enough in immersing the audience within its attempted high intensity to warrant submission into the illusions of the ride. Hex, another ride at the park which was operating at the same time as Sub Terra, is a good example of a ride that provides a more successful illusion. The ride is gentle and advertises itself as such, and bases itself within the towers and the history behind them. But I, as a guest, could not figure out the way the room would spin around as the benches lightly swayed. I knew I wasn't actually going upside down, but I nonetheless allowed myself to be tricked into it because the ride was consistent in its presentation. Audience members are really annoying sometimes, and they want to find ways to disrupt the illusion of these types of experiences. They want to see behind the curtain or comprehend the physical mechanics of what they're experiencing. With Sub Terra, you are more likely to figure out that the things poking your back are pistons, not the monster. The breathing down your neck is just a vent, and so on. Hex has its illusions far enough out of reach for the audience to remain charmed by its machinations. Coupled with the little bits of nitpicking earlier about the phalanx soldiers, it becomes easier to unwrap the magic behind Sub Terra. It therefore fails both in its thrill factor and its escapist theatrical factor, as well as the ride just feeling so short in comparison to what was expected of it. With the whole tourist gaze thing I mentioned earlier, you can probably imagine that this ride becomes undesirable to the eye of both of those audiences, so it garners a reputation for being a bad ride. It also has a very unique position in that it's a ride that is almost like a sequel of another ride without it being related to some type of transmedial content. And I swear I'm using that word for a reason, by the way. Transmedial just being a fancy word for when two types of media interconnect with each other. The Sonic the Hedgehog ride is transmedial because it combines Alton Towers with a real video game that exists outside of the boundaries of the park. Sub Terra, however, hinges its importance on being related to another important ride within the park, which I don't seem to find that often when you look at other parks around the globe. It therefore does not have any inherent draw outside of its own advertisement as a thrill ride. People won't ride it for novelty in the same way people do for Sonic Spinball. If it's a bad ride, you don't claim to just ride it because you're just that into the lore of Nemesis the roller coaster. Nemesis Sub Terra had a 3-year run, perhaps the shortest run of any thrill ride in the park's history, before closing in 2015, unable to reach the seemingly impeachable prestige of its roller coaster sister. Luckily, Alton Towers has other rides, so it doesn't suffer a particularly dramatic loss in reputation. People just ride Nemesis instead of going to Sub Terra for an adequate thrill. However, it was around the time that Sub Terra was closing that something else pretty damaging happened at Alton Towers that all but sealed Sub Terra's fate. It's probably the biggest incident at a theme park in British memory, that being the Smiler incident. Sub Terra's closure was preceded by the Smiler incident 2 months earlier, wherein 2 people had partial leg amputations after 2 carts crashed into one another at a midsection of the track. This story went huge. Lawsuits were made, and every time Alton Towers had a fault with its thrill rides since that incident, a story was quickly published questioning the overall safety of the park. This was a large issue for a park that predicated its advertisements on being a tad suspicious and unsafe, and since then, certain voiceovers for rides like Oblivion saying the ride is unsafe were removed, so as not to echo actual accounts of what previous guests have seen at the park. The media would also haunt Alton Towers way through until the Smiler reopened almost a year later. The dark fantasy offered by the park became rather fickle during 2015, with a closed Smiler ominously lying in wait, a suddenly real threat placed in a location built on fantasy. But yet, Sub Terra's facility remained closed, only to open its doors for a few scare mazes the park would have in its Halloween seasons for the coming years. It now occasionally has the odd theme park fan reflecting and remembering the ride in a more nostalgic light, but in such a way that they, like myself, mourn a time I can no longer return to, rather than to recall the quality of its experience. Even when something is really bad, if it creates a space and culture around it, there is a type of comfort to be found in the moments that it creates. Dr. Rebecca Williams notes this in her chapter on replacing and remembering rides in her book, Theme Park Fandom. The importance of being within a particular physical space and experiencing certain elements of the theme park environment offers a sense of reassurance and comfort. So when certain attractions come to a close, there is a type of ontological anxiety that comes about when the park begins to shift into something you no longer remember. The theatricality of a theme park is liminal in style, a way to catch up with your inner child perhaps, while your home life and personal responsibilities are put on hold. That desire for escapism, however, has a want to be seen in the ideal world you would prefer to inhabit. So when the attractions built for this specific purpose cannot live up to the fantasies, I can only feel somewhat bleakly reminded that I am in fact placed within my own world. Sub Terra to me is a bit of a disappointed sigh in reflection of a teenager that just wanted to experience a more thrilling life. But nonetheless, I still am trying to take that perfect picture of myself, just like that mum is of her child and the Sonic the Hedgehog mascot.